Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm Jeff Howe, joined by CJ Vogel and Gerry Hamilton. We're going to look at areas of improvement where improvement is needed for Texas in 2026. This edition of On Texas Football is brought to you by our friends over at South Point Dodge. Texas football fans, you can score an easy extra point when you get to the point at South Point Dodge. South Point Dodge has over 600 vehicles in stock, including the all-new 2025 Ram 1500. Get the real deal today and drive away in an all-new Ram that's proven to last. Plus, you get employee incentive pricing. That's right. You pay what their employees pay. That is a real deal. So score big today at South Point Dodge. Go see them off I-35 in South Austin or at southpointdodge.com. Get to the point at South Point Dodge. Guys, when we look at areas to improve, I think maybe the biggest area, and it's the one I'm probably most disappointed in because it just seems to keep getting worse, are the penalties. Texas was the third most penalized team per game in FBS this year. Penalty yards per game, guys, there were only 4 power conference teams that had more penalty yards per game than Texas. CJ, I'll start with you. What needs to be done to, I don't know if Sark needs to get the cattle prod out during practice or what, but something needs to be done to cut down on the penalties.
Yeah, look, we've talked to a number of former players, on this channel about penalties and the ways that former coaches, that former staffs used to, kind of rectify common traits or, just consistent themes of teams. And look, penalties is one that Texas needs to address. And I don't know if that's bleachers. I don't know if that's early morning suicides. I don't know what it is, but something's got to be done, right? And for me, it's the way in which these penalties are committed. And that's the biggest frustration. And I know, Gerry, you've got some numbers here. The one for me, and I don't have specific statistics on it, but special teams penalties are a killer for Texas. And they've been for 2 years, right? And, I know Texas likes to be aggressive, but the blocks and the backs and the holdings that push you back into, starting drives on your own 8, 9, 10-yard line and now having to go 90 yards instead of 75, right? That's really where things just build and add up for Texas. That just, it can't happen. Obviously, we've seen it for 2 years now. False starts, pre-snap penalties have been an issue. I think that comes with times playing in tough environments on the SEC with young offensive linemen. Texas, obviously, had 2 straight years of right tackles being very young. That dissipated this year as the season progressed. But, I think, again, just making life that much more difficult on yourself in this conference is a recipe for failure. And that was something that Texas from week 1 made sure that they said, hey, we want this to be on the most difficult level as possible. And that's basically the theme of the season for me on the penalty side.
Gerry, to the point, CJ's point on penalties, I think about, the games Texas lost this year, specifically Ohio State and Georgia, pre-snap penalties on defense in both those games. And Gerry, this is the second year in a row where you've had a regular season meeting against Georgia where the game was still relatively in your control. You got a really nice kickoff return, but it got called back because of a holding penalty and you lost field position. So, Gerry, to me, it's in the big games when penalties are happening that those kinds of penalties will kill you against really good opponents.
It's very difficult to be a championship level anything in sports if you are undisciplined. And that is unforced turnovers, that is penalties, no matter what sport you're looking at, right? The timeliness of those penalties is what you guys were talking about. There's been some big plays, big moments in games where penalties negatively impacted Texas. Look, a telling stat for this is in 2024, Texas averaged 6.4 penalties per game. This year, they went up to 8. They jumped up 1.6 penalties a game. That's my biggest issue is it went in the wrong direction this year and by a healthy margin, That's my issue. It's just really difficult. If you look at the team you cheer for and say, man, they're just not a disciplined team, then to expect a championship.
Yeah.
It very rarely happens when those two things go together.
And real quick, because on penalties and what we've heard about this team pretty consistently is that they're a young team, right? Young teams typically try to press in those big games. Young teams inexperienced, they might not know when to let go on a hold. They might not know things. That needs to be taught out because guess who else is a pretty young team this year? And we've heard it from Steve Sarkisian It's Georgia, and it's Ohio State. Both teams that you lost to, both teams sitting at 4.4 and 4.5 penalties per game. That's almost cut in half of what you're committing, despite youth being an issue for all three teams. So it starts with the staff. It starts in the offseason. It starts with that self-discipline. So it's got to self-correct itself this offseason.
Yeah.
Yep, no doubt. The other issue that I think is top of mind for a lot of Longhorn fans, I know it is for us. Jerry, I'll start with you. The Texas run game in conference play averaged a little over 93 yards per game. That was dead last in the SEC. And you only got to that point, as CJ mentioned during our pre-show chat, because Texas A&M's run defense was atrocious and you were able to pile up some yardage against the Aggies. But, Jerry, the run game, whether it was conference play, even non-conference play, it was not anywhere near what it needed to be this year.
No, I mean, look, Texas was down 30 yards per game this year on the season. And that's with mobility at quarterback this year, which you didn't really have last year. So that is a major number when you think about it. If you took away Arch's run game off this team, what are you looking at? What are you looking at? You're looking at 100 yards per game on average. I mean, that would have been a 59, 60-yard difference from last year to this year. That is a massive number. And again, there's, if you look in college football, there's two things you need to be able to do. You have to be a disciplined team, and you have to be able to run the football to close out games or on command when the situation calls for it, when the season's on the line. And that is the tough thing about Texas this year. That's why they're sitting at 9-3 and on the way outside looking at the college football playoffs. Those two things right there to start before we get to the last one, which really got ugly the second half of the season. But look, to me, there's also the Tony Hills argument, which I don't disagree with. That's commitment to run game.
Yeah. There's
got to be a willingness to accept 1-yard runs and 2-yard runs more often in the future for Steve Sarkisian. You have to be willing to accept those because that's becomes part of who you are as a program. Yep. That no matter what, we are still going to stick with the run game. Even if it's not what we want, we're still going to demand the opponent know we're going to be willing to run the football. And that is what's the biggest thing that's got to change. Yes, some of the offensive linemen will change. Yes, some of the running backs have changed over time, right? But there's a physicality and a brand of willingness that goes into being a physical football team. Yeah. Because if you look around, what teams have that? What teams have that? Georgia had that. Georgia ran the ball more effectively this year versus last year, but they still had that last year, even though they weren't as good running the football. Ohio State has that under Ryan Day. There has to be willingness to run the football, and it can't just go week to week. It has to be in your program if you're ever going to reach the top of the mountain.
Yeah, Jerry, you're 100% spot on because I think when you we're going to keep mentioning Georgia because that's where Texas is trying to get. And I feel like especially the two regular season meetings that Texas had with Georgia each of the last 2 years, I think Mike Bobo called a game very similar to the game Sark called against Oklahoma, Jerry. And I think that, for me, is what's frustrating with the run game because we saw Sark today. We may take some tackles for loss. We may not spring a bunch of explosive runs, but we're going to understand that, hey, a 3-yard gain is really good for us. If we just kind of stick to it and keep running with it. And what happened? That was the best defensive front in the country. We know how physical Red River is. And there was a point where Texas was leaning on Oklahoma later in that game, similar to what Georgia did to Texas this year. They took those 2- and 3-yard gains, and as the game went on, the 2- and 3-yarders became 5- and 6-yarders, and the 5- and 6-yarders became explosive runs. CJ, I'm with Jerry on mentality, but I want to, wherever you want to go with it. But I think from a scheme standpoint, I think Sark also needs to rethink some things because to me, they've just been way too wide zone dependent. And when you get a defense that shuts down your wide zone run game, they have not had a counterpunch the last 2 years.
No, they've not. And that's, again, the big concern when you play an opposing front with the speed of an Ohio State or Georgia. Well, you're kind of SOL when it comes to your run game because you don't have the downhill power between the tackles running scheme. And that comes with personnel, but that comes schematically in the willingness that we're talking about here, right? So that needs to change. And anything else for me that I wanted to hound on because, look, Jerry, I think you mentioned it. Texas is, inability to run against top tier guys. Jeff, you also talked about 93 yards per game in conference play. Look, that was a number that was 70. They averaged 70 yards per game on the ground in SEC play before playing Texas A&M. That was 25 yards worse than anybody else in the conference. And that's just in the conference. So the one thing for me that needs to improve, and I have to give Sark credit because I think he very quickly understood that he couldn't do it this year, was just, hey, I need a yard. Let me just give it to a running back and go power up front. He said, no, we can't do that. We saw it towards the back end. Obviously, the quarterback run in the red zone, the Nick Townsend fly sweep. That's great. That's how you adjust as a head coach to the strengths and the weaknesses of your team. But it shouldn't be that difficult to gain a 3rd and 1 yard. And for 2 years now, you've sat around and said, well, I don't know on 3rd and 1 if we can do it right away. Do we need to get tricky? Do we need 2 downs to do that? On the goal line especially, I could point to a number of instances where Texas was stymied at the goal line and sitting there saying, well, this is an inferior front. Against the non-conference teams, Texas needed 4 or 5 different opportunities to gain 1 yard against a team they should have had, 20 or 30 pounds on. So that's my frustration. And it starts up front. I think it starts with personnel. But, Jerry, above anything else, it starts with that mentality that, hey, I'm going to move you before you move me. And I think that lacks at times. So, above anything else, that's it for me.
To your point, CJ, here's the way I always look at sports, okay? The players changed and the results stayed the same.
Yeah.
That's the major issue you have. That means it's a mentality thing running the football. If the players change and the results stay the same in the key situations in the key games, then there's only one answer. It's pretty simple stuff at that point.
I like anytime we're out on the road, Jerry, and we talk to recruits, and Jeff, you got to see Caden Scherer, and I'm going to go to him specifically. But when I go out there and I ask recruits, hey, especially offensive linemen, one word to describe your game, what do you say? If I don't hear mean or nasty from an offensive lineman, I start to wonder, what's their future? And Caden Scherer said exactly that. I loved it. But I'm starting to sit there and say, if you were to just take each individual offensive lineman over the last 2 or 3 years, how many of them could you really describe them as a mean or nasty offensive lineman? And look, I think that's kind of one of those things that's taught to them. Hey, physicality is a must. It's not a turn it off. It's not a light switch, right? So that's something I hope changes. And I think a lot of that comes with, how your offseason drilled into you as well.
Guys, one area where Texas really struggled was defensively, just tie the front end with the back end. Coverage was an issue. And, Jerry, I know we did some of the watch alongs and we'd be frustrated with some of the off coverage, especially early in the Florida game. And there was a couple others, but one number that really has stood out to me is Texas this season through 12 games has given up 113 completions of 10 or more yards. 92 of those have come in SEC play. Only Vanderbilt's allowed more. So, Jerry, I'll start with you. It's not necessarily, that tells me it's not necessarily the chunk yards, the big over-the-top plays that are getting this defense. It's kind of those 10 to 20-yarders, that intermediate game where Texas is getting killed. We saw them tighten up coverage, Jerry, as the season went on. But hey, we'll see if there's coaching changes or whatever happens in the offseason or just a mindset change. But, Jerry, they've got to do a better job of taking away easy completions in 26.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, and that's the mentality part on the defensive side of the ball for me. And I don't have an issue with off coverage, right? Everybody plays off coverage to a certain extent. Now, what do you do? Do you bail from the off coverage, right? How do you disguise that coverage? And is it off coverage at both corner spots? There's a lot that goes into that. But and when you have a really good pass rush, I think the thing that frustrated Texas fans, when you have a really good pass rush and everybody knows you have a good pass rush, you're not really maximizing your pass rush if you play way off in coverage. Because you're even as talented as some of your pass rushers are, they're not going to have time to get home. That's the issue you have. Last year, by the way, from a statistical standpoint, Texas gave up 237.9 yards passing per game this year. In 2024, that was 173.8. So we're talking about a massive, massive jump of 64 yards per game. And Jahdae Barron was a great player. Andrew Makuba was tremendous. They tied the whole thing together last year. I think they could mask some deficiencies because of the plays Jahdae Barron came and made when he wasn't the even in the play and still came off of his spot and made big plays, just football recognition plays, Makuba football recognition plays. So I think that helped mask a potential issue that popped up this year at times. But it's hard to justify for fans. And I'm trying to speak to the fans here, knowing you have a really good pass rush and then you're not aggressive in coverage very often behind it. Because then you're like, we're wasting what Colin Simmons has, and then don't get started on him dropping in the coverage. But you're wasting really good pass rush if you're playing off coverage and then you bail it all within that coverage.
Yeah, Jerry, I've said it a lot, and I think it's worth repeating. I've loved what PK's done with this defense. Texas is fielding defenses that are good enough to win you big games and win you championships, but I hated when Manny Diaz did it to Alex Okafor. I hated when Todd Orlando did it to Joseph Osai. And CJ, on third down, when I see Colin Simmons 15 yards off the ball, that call needs to go away. You need to scrap it. Yeah. It's worth a hat throw. But CJ, to Jerry's point, things just did not get tied together with the front end and the back end. And, the way we think about Arch Manning on offense, CJ, that's how I'm thinking about Colin Simmons on defense. You got a special game-wrecking pass rusher. You got to tighten things up because you can't have him affect the quarterback and then you're unable to do anything about it on the back end.
All too often it felt like a bailout, and that's literally and figuratively, talking about bailing out of your position off coverage. But I'd like to see more stick your foot in the ground and make a play on the football. I thought Cade Phillips has that ability. I thought, Kobe Black showed that twice in the A&M game as well. Maybe it's personnel, maybe it's scheme, or maybe just more what can these guys do with their length and their size. But I thought all too often Texas kind of went away from what that 2024 team had, which was I'm reading the eyes to go make a play on the football. And that's a shame because, look, there's some talented football players in this secondary, right? Malik Muhammad, Jelani McDonald, Grayson Littleton, Michael Taft, former All-American. The one thing for me, and I'll be quick here, 128th against conference teams. That's what Texas ranked in 10-plus pass plays allowed, and then 113th in the country in 20-plus yards allowed as well. So you have a top 5 pass rush in the country. To your point, Jeff, you should be making these windows smaller and smaller on the outside. If you get beat deep, hey, there's going to be pressure. That better be a perfect ball if it's going to be a completion. Instead, Texas kind of said, no, we're going to play this soft, kind of off coverage. Pressure gets there, that's fine. But that window never shrunk on the outside. And that's where that complementary style comes into play.
And I think the frustrating thing with that was the Florida game was, I think, really frustrating because LSU pressured Lagway in the 5 interceptions the game before.
Mm-hmm.
And they made life very easy on DJ Lagway in Gainesville, Texas did. And I think that was maybe one of my more frustrating moments of the 2025 season was a guy, LSU disguised blitzes. They confused Lagway. He never got comfortable against Miami or LSU and ends up throwing 5 interceptions against LSU. And then his next game out, it was pitch and catch to start the game. That to me was poor planning.
What does give me hope, Jerry, and I guess it's kind of the good and bad with the secondary. Your 2 leaders in pass breakups in the regular season were Cade Phillips and Grayson Littleton. Littleton, we know, played a lot, but Cade Phillips, I don't know, maybe probably shouldn't have been your leader in PBUs with as little as he played and played more toward the back end. But, hey, does give you hope that things will get better in 2026. One position group, Jerry, I'll start with you, that I think we talked about maybe needing improvement. Look, Sark, for better or worse, he wants to run 12 personnel. He wants to utilize 2 tight end sets. If you're going to do that in 26, Jerry, you got to get a lot more out of the tight end position than you got this year.
Yeah, so look, I think they're going to have to be more physical blocking. And I do think Nick Townsend in year 2 with a big expanded role is going to step up and be a major player in this football program. But then the other thing off of 12 personnel for me is everybody has to be a threat in the passing game. Like it's almost like if you play 12 personnel and one of those guys is essentially an extra offensive lineman, but maybe isn't a great blocker, consistent blocker, then you're just playing 10 on 11 at that point, right? I mean, so there's two ways to go about 12 personnel. There's one, you actually have a hammer of a blocker in 12 personnel, then your other guy is a quality blocker, but he's a threat in the passing game. Or if you don't have that, then both the guys have to be a threat in the passing game. You have to be able to put pressure, max pressure on the defense through the passing game if you're going to be in 12 personnel, unless one of those guys is a really good blocker. So I think Texas is going to have to find that balance there. I kind of wonder with CJ in some 12 next year, if you assume Jack Entries goes pro, right? Which I think a lot of people think he does. Can Nick Townsend and Emory Winston, before you factor in anybody else, can those guys put enough pressure on a defense as pass catchers to where that kind of changes the game when Texas is in 12 personnel? Now that Arch has a year under his belt. But the only way that works is if you're 5 offensive linemen, if you're in 5-man protect, can protect long enough to let plays develop. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all ties together next year.
Mm-hmm.
The only other thing, CJ, I'll go to you with this. Where's Arch Manning need to improve in 2026? Because as good as Arch was, there's always things you can improve on and get better. Where do you think 16 needs to clean some things up in 26?
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is any type of underneath mesh route, right? But, more specifically, I think, look, it's just the down-to-down consistency in some of the arm mechanics, right? The throwing mechanisms that allow him to put the ball where he wants to be. And look, second half of the year, I thought he was fantastic. Final 5 games, I don't need to go through the numbers, but when you only have 2 turnovers against your final 5 SEC teams, 3 of which being top 10 at the time, that's fantastic. That shows you his decision-making is improving. Now, there are some certain plays, especially in that first half against Texas A&M, where you say, okay, the mechanics when you get out of the pocket, they feel rushed. Even against a good pass rush, he still feels like he's rushing throws at times. He's sailing them, he's pulling them. And the one that really comes to mind against A&M is, he's rolling out to his right. He has opportunity to run. He finds Mosley in the back of the end zone, and he starts playing skee ball, right? The ball bounces about 5 yards right in front of your wide receiver. And look, that's a throw that he should be able to make. It's a throw that he's shown that he can make, but it's the consistency in which, hey, go back to the first play of the game against Ohio State, week 1. What was it? Very similar, outside the pocket, rolling right, and he skips it to DeAndre Moore. So it's just the fine things of being consistent, because I think the decision-making's there. I didn't think all too often this year did I see passes and say, ooh, that was a horrible decision, especially not late in the year. So that's the thing for me. Decision-making's getting there. The speed of the game is slowing down. Now it's about making sure that when you get into your position to throw a football, down to down, play to play, throw to throw, it's consistent.
Jerry, in all the years that I've known you, we've talked a lot about quarterbacks, and anticipation and decision-making seem to be the 2 big things that come up. Arch seems to have, I don't want to say conquered, because I don't know that any quarterback ever figures that out, but it seems like, at least for where he needs to be right now, I feel like he's cleared those hurdles, Jerry, where you don't necessarily question that stuff. You think he's there at that point where you don't worry about his ability to anticipate or make decisions?
No, yeah, I don't at all. I mean, after the UTEP game, I was concerned for his future, and he overcame the mental hurdles. I mean, I'll keep saying it. I was concerned for the guy after that game. Like, I was like, wow, this is a big hill mentally he's got to climb, and he climbed it. And so ultimate credit to him for being a competitor, mentally tough and resilient, because that's what this season was about for him. But yeah, I trust the decision-making. I think he's going to take a big step in year 2. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But in order for him to clear that big hurdle in year 2, it's what CJ mentioned. It's the easy throws. It's the throws he's been making since he was 12 years old.
Screen throws even.
Yeah. I mean, look, he's completed 61.4 this year. That number, we need to be talking about this next year, and that number is 65.5, 66. Because if he does that, he started hitting the easy throws. Started hitting the easy throws.
Yep.
Because if he hits the easy throws, he's going to be a 66, 67% passer.
Yeah, look, he'll never be a 70% guy. He throws the ball, he takes the shots downfield, and I know folks see that across the country. Oregon's always a school where you see the very high completion percentage for quarterbacks. Look at the average distance of target there, right? That's a lot of underneath. And to your point, Jerry, that's great. That's how you should boost your stats. That's how your completion percentage should increase. And for Arch, I think it'll be in there. A little bit of that as well is just, hey, you don't need that fastball all the time. It's kind of the complete opposite of what Texas dealt with Quinn, and kind of the feathering. So that'll be a room for improvement. Fortunately, Texas should be returning some pretty talented wide receivers for him as well.
No doubt. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this edition of On Texas Football. Jerry, CJ, thank you guys for the knowledge and expertise as always. Thank you to Matthew behind the scenes for producing it. Thank you to our friends at South Point Dodge for sponsoring it. If you're not a member, over at ontexasfootball.com, that's all right. You can get over to the site right now and sign up using the promo code OTFOG, and that'll get you 1 year of access for $39.95. Make sure that you like this video and that you're subscribed to the On Texas Football YouTube channel. That way, whether it's here on the channel or on the site, you're not missing any of our Longhorn coverage all year round. Jerry, for CJ, for Matthew, for the entire On Texas Football staff, I'm Jeff Howe. Thank you so much for watching and listening. And until next time, welcome.